What a strange world we live in. That I would come to find the sequel to 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos a welcome reprieve from anything. But here we are. There must be chaos dragons afoot, looking out for this discordant one. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hi, welcome back to the channel. Or if you're new here, hi, I'm Cass. I'm a cognitive psychologist who has an interest in the scientific backbone of more mainstream works. My first project in this vein was Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life and Antidote to Chaos, and it seemed that more often than not, the references brought in to support the arguments were either not represented well or had little to do with the claims being made, when they weren't just forays into German philosophy or biblical texts. As discussed in that series, Peterson is free to write whatever form of life advice he sees fit. The issue is that his branding and credibility is rooted in his clinical psychology background, so when large chunks of advice are being supported by works like the Bible or Nietzsche, as opposed to empirical publications more in keeping with his training, there appears to be a mismatch or improper fit in how the book was being marketed. As such, my project was to follow the arguments and logic and point out where things were lining up and where the academic holes were. I should emphasize, in case you're not familiar, that Peterson's training is in clinical psychology, mine is in cognitive. And we're both in psychology, but there are distinctions between these branches of psychology. And the thing I want to draw your attention to here at the outset is I have zero training in counseling or clinical psych. None. I've never even taken a counseling class. My bread and butter has been things like attention and learning. Other cognitive psychologists study things like memory, categorization, language, cognitive processes. So I can read psychology papers of many different fields, and then some. But when we get into the specifics of counseling or clinical best practices, what is the current state of the field, that's not what my background is in. Sneaking in a pinch of channel business, my next video will be continuing on with Abigail Schreier's Irreversible Damage, and then the video after that will be Beyond Order, and we'll keep doing that until I probably finish Irreversible Damage, and might sneak in a fun video here or there. So, if you aren't here for the Peterson party, see you in the next video. No worries. Back to this video. The script was basically written in two chunks, before I had the book and after. So until we get to the overture and the book itself, we're going to quickly rehash the first book, talk about what's been going on in the interim, and also highlight some questions or predictions going into the second book. But enough chit-chat. Let's get one last little thing out of the way so we can start. Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. In these videos, I use a visual shorthand to indicate where the ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book, or integrating my thoughts with science. Although honestly, I should rebrand this section as references and sometimes science, given the different authors' tendency to cite things like philosophy or blog posts. But science is so much more fun to say. Either way, let's talk about where we've been so we can get to the start of moving beyond order. A bit has happened since 12 Rules for Life was published in 2018. That's it? Feels like it's been ages since then. Large scale. We're still feeling the effects of COVID-19 and the pandemic and the quarantine that started last year. Time will tell if the Black Lives Matter movement has made lasting changes. Trans rights has become more of a battleground, and in US politics, we've seen some change, but also more of the same. Relevant to this video, Peterson has been through a bit too. A busy touring schedule after the original book's release, his wife's diagnosis and treatment of cancer, and let's call it a medical journey related to anti-anxiety medication use and stopping its use that took him and his daughter's family around North America, Russia, and Serbia. As I said earlier, this portion of the video was written without having the book, so it wasn't clear how much these local or global events would factor into the book. Let's talk a little about the original book. 12 Rules for Life was described by Peterson as a refinement of an answer he posted on Quora to the question, "What are the most valuable things everyone should know?" And at the time of producing this video, the publisher said that over 5 million copies of this book have been sold. Somewhat amusing now, it seemed from how the first book was written, it would be a standalone work. Both Peterson, in the parenting chapter, and Dr. Norman Doidge in the foreword indicated that it was important to not have too many rules. Too many rules is on the path to tyranny, which is order run amok, and that must be avoided. But here we are, a couple years later with a sequel called Beyond Order with 12 more rules, which seems to kind of go against that whole tyrannical order thing. So I have to say, I am curious how these apparently contradictory states are going to be reconciled. Part of the overall gist I got from the first book is that the way we've tended to do things is the way we should continue to do things, and veering from tradition leads to nihilism and chaos. And this is in keeping with the book's subtitle, An Antidote to Chaos. But in the book, Peterson would sometimes say that we need to find the balance between order and chaos. But that would sometimes not mesh with the messages themselves, which lean more towards the order side of things in the form of tradition. However, it took me over 30 videos to get through the book, so that is a very distilled version of the gist. The length of my series on this book also hints at a problem with it. The surface level messages were frequently okay, like be precise in your speech. That's reasonable advice. But when you dig into the details behind the surface message, things get less reasonable. Like in the verbal precision chapter, where a good chunk of it was spent describing a hypothetical woman finding out her hypothetical husband had been cheating on her, and the insinuation that he had strayed because she wasn't putting out enough because she was angry with men. My little shocked and confused corner Pikachu became an apt representation of my feelings, more frequently than I would think ideal in a book of life advice. The snippets of rules we've seen so far seem to be incredibly specific, or possible retreads of things from the first book. I guess we'll find out what these new rules are bringing to the life advice party. Well look, it's got an author's note about the pandemic. The basic gist here is Peterson sees two choices for anybody writing today. One is to incorporate the pandemic into their work at the cost of instantly dating it, or to just ignore the pandemic altogether, which makes the work more timeless, at the cost of ignoring the proverbial elephant under the rug. Peterson chose option 2, according to the plan laid out for this book several years ago. Wait, when exactly did the plan for this book get made? She asks, knowing it'll be answered shortly. I can see the point about tying in too much about the pandemic, potentially dating the book, but I also think there's a lot of general life advice and ponderings about human nature to be pulled from this ongoing situation. If we can spend part of the book talking about his medical journey, we can spend some time talking about relevant things from the pandemic. On further reflection, though, option 2 is a bit of a cop-out. It lets him not talk about some of the public measures put in place to try to stop the spread of the virus, as at least some of his Twitter and ThinkSpot followers were asking him to do, especially like masking or the vaccine. I'll point out at the start here that about half of this overture seems to be written for people who haven't kept up with what he's been up to since the last book. I also want to reiterate something I've said pretty much every time we've talked about Peterson's medical journey. Calling him an addict or a pill popper or things of that nature doesn't really seem to be that great a representation of his experience, and is also stigmatizing addiction itself. If anything, the lengths he and his family went to for him to stop using this medication seems almost like an anti-addict. Like, forcing your body to just cold turkey and go into a hard withdrawal from benzodiazepines is incredibly risky. Don't do this. But it's something that he did a couple times. And I would think that somebody who's physically and psychologically addicted to a substance wouldn't do this. Peterson starts the overture talking about waking up in Moscow strapped to a hospital bed in enough detail to make me uncomfortable. If this is your first video of mine this has come up, the relevant part is my dad spent some time in the ICU prior to his death when I was a teen. And given his state, he was strapped to the bed in a manner similar to what Peterson described. So I guess it can't be said that Peterson doesn't evoke vivid imagery. Moving on. Peterson said he can't remember much of that time, but could recall earlier in the year working on this book, and that would have been during his wife's cancer treatment and then his own medical journey. And what follows is a mostly chronological detailing of where he's been and what happened. As we've been mostly keeping up with this, we'll go through it, but mostly spend time on points where details are clarified, omitted, or other noteworthy things. In January of 2019, his daughter Michaela had her artificial ankle replaced in Zurich. Why she needed the surgery, despite Peterson claiming in Rule 12 that someone fixed her foot, is discussed in that video. In March, Peterson's wife Tammy had surgery to remove kidney cancer, but experienced complications, in part because they thought it was a less nasty version of the cancer than it turned out to be. And some new information is provided here on the nature of the complications and treatments she went through. The infamous apple cider incidents mentioned, with Peterson discussing the symptoms he experienced, like anxiety, feeling extremely cold, insomnia, and feeling like he was going to pass out when standing. This time, he says it appeared to be an autoimmune reaction, with the footnote indicating that it made a certain sense at the time to assume this was immune-related. However, it isn't clarified if he still thinks this was a sulfite allergic reaction, or if he was experiencing a pretty bad flare-up of anxiety, or what. Because a lot of this just sounds like really bad anxiety from my personal experience. He was prescribed a benzodiazepine plus something for sleep, but only ended up using the benzo. And by March, the family's various health problems exacerbated his anxiety, so he asked the doctor for an increased dose. In Michaela's first podcast with Peterson, he mentioned that he and Tammy had traveled in February in the lead up to her surgery, and I could see the cancer diagnosis, plus the stress of being a public figure, bringing anxiety to the forefront. Peterson says that his anxiety continued to get worse, so asked for another dose bump. Who are his doctors that are just agreeing to this? Because that has not been my experience for any medication. I'm not doubting that this happened for him, but holy shit, that has not been my experience. At some point later, his increasing anxiety was diagnosed as a paradoxical reaction to the benzos, without providing information on when this diagnosis happened or by whom. In May, under the advice of his psychiatrist, he stopped taking the benzos cold turkey and tried ketamine. It sounds like it was done as an infusion, which is all the medical rage at least in California right now, but this isn't explicitly said. He does note that these ketamine treatments were 2 90-minute trips to hell. I felt to my bones as if I had everything to feel guilty and ashamed about, with nothing gained by my positive experiences. I was a little confused here, so I revisited my old notes and videos. In Michaela's original update video at the start of Peterson's journey, she indicated the abrupt medication stop happened over the summer, so my original inference this happened closer to September appears to be incorrect. After the second ketamine treatment, Peterson got hit by the benzo withdrawal. And we've talked about this previously, but one of the things you'll experience coming off of a benzo, even tapering it down, is an increase in your anxiety, which Peterson describes. I want to reiterate that you should not abruptly stop taking a benzodiazepine. Doing so puts you at a risk of seizure and possibly death if you don't give your brain and body a chance to reacclimate to life without that drug there. And if your doctor is telling you to do this, check with the pharmacist. They tend to know what's up, they tend to be there for you to talk to, and they can tell you, yeah, this is something that's okay, or we need to talk to your doctor. Peterson's other problems were akathisia, destructive thoughts, and an absence of happiness. We spent a bit of time talking about akathisia in the podcast response video, so we'll skip that here. But something that isn't clear from the book is what he currently takes the cause of the akathisia to be. The way it's written, it sort of sounds like it was as a consequence of abruptly stopping the medication, but in the podcast, they said it was from the clonazepam itself. And in the response post by Peterson of his and Michaela's interview with a reporter from the Times, Michaela told the reporter, among other things, that the akathisia is caused by any medication, basically, that's a psych med. No. It can be a side effect of some psych meds for some people, but not everybody on a psych med will experience this. Stop fear-mongering. A doctor friend warned Peterson about benzo withdrawal and not doing it cold turkey, So he started back on it at a reduced dose, plus an antidepressant that made him really tired and hungry. And what this antidepressant was, or the dose he was taking it, is not shared. After a couple months, Peterson checked into a US withdrawal clinic, which set him up on a taper. But he says they weren't able to adequately address what he was experiencing side effect-wise. He left in November. This intermediate step between cold turkey and the withdrawal clinic is new information. In December, he was checked into a hospital in Toronto, and that's the last he remembers until waking up in a hospital in Moscow. His daughter and son-in-law moved him to Moscow for treatment as he was not improving in Canada. Plus, they say he developed pneumonia while in the Toronto hospital. I'll just mention the Sunday Times interview and transcript here again. Even with Michaela's many words, what exactly was going on is not very clear. What a first quote to start with. But I don't want to misrepresent or misquote anything here.
I was there primarily so that the clinic could facilitate my withdrawal from benzodiazepines, using a procedure either unknown or regarded as too dangerous in North America. Since I had not been able to tolerate any decrease in dosage whatsoever, apart from the initial reduction months before, the clinic placed me in a medically induced coma so that I might remain unconscious during the very worst withdrawal symptoms. That regimen started January 5th and lasted 9 days, during which I was also placed in a machine so that my breathing was mechanically regulated. On January 14th, I was taken off the anesthetic and the intubation. I woke up for a few hours and indicated during this time to Michaela that I was no longer suffering from akathisia, although I remember nothing of this.
I don't want to focus on the Times interview too much, but it's noted that that Moscow clinic typically did that detox treatment for opiate withdrawal, not benzos. And withdrawing from opiates is a completely different beast. The book also doesn't mention the plasmapheresis that was talked about in the podcast and the transcript. Towards the end of January, Peterson was moved to a different ICU for neurological rehabilitation before going to a rehab center in February. There's an emphasis on this being for Peterson to relearn how to do things. It's unclear how much of this is neurological damage, possibly from something like the seizure activity that was mentioned, and how much is needing to rebuild up the muscles after being bedridden for an extended period of time, or other factors that just weren't talked about. After he got a bit better, they went to Florida to recuperate. At that point, he was still experiencing numbness in his left hand and foot, trembling of those two extremities, as well as muscles in his forehead, seizure activity, and crippling anxiety. What exactly seizure activity is not specified. Seizure activity seems like a pretty huge deal, so I'm surprised it wasn't elaborated on or specified more clearly in the book, or really mentioned in previous interviews. He tried to come off the medication he started in Russia, but doesn't say what that medication was. But he does say that as he stepped the dose down, his negative experiences increased, so ended up back at the original dose. Morale was low. Towards the end of May, Peterson, Michaela, and her family went to Serbia for a clinic that practiced a novel approach to the problem of benzodiazepine withdrawal. What this novel approach is not said. But while putting my tabs in the book, I noticed that the coda this time around is basically a list of thanks for everybody who helped Peterson since the last book, including the Serbian doctor who treated him, one Dr. Igor Bulbuk, who is associated with all kinds of fun stuff on Google. BestAgeForever.com does treatments ranging from run-of-the-mill cosmetic stuff, like Botox or fillers, to plasmapheresis and xenon therapy, which involves breathing in xenon. For reasons. CocaineRehabVIP.com, and if that didn't just kill my monetization, Patreon? This website indicates treatments ranging from body detoxification using things like plasmapheresis or xenon gas to anti-craving treatment, which involves ibogaine and a psychedelic experience. Ibogaine is related to the vine used in the preparation of ayahuasca. To be more specific, the vine is part of the recipe that doesn't contribute DMT. So demonetized. NoDrugsAnymore.com isn't as flashy a website, like parts of it still have the default text from the template. The treatment here seems to involve some sort of device, also shown on the VIP website, that helps. Somehow. Yep. Okay then. Peterson moves on to say that these experiences were awful, and he doesn't want to lessen the negative aspects of them by saying that they're better for it, but
passing so near to death motivated my wife to attend to some issues regarding her own spiritual and creative development more immediately and assiduously than she might otherwise have. And me to write or to preserve while editing only those words in this book that retain their significance, even under conditions characterized by extreme suffering.
He thanks his family, friends, and work for the motivation to keep going. I'm trying to go easy on the snark because the true Petersoning hasn't started yet, and his medical journey sounds legitimately awful. But I wonder if this was easier for Tammy to do with him out of the country. And because we're going to pivot away from his medical journey, one final pondering is if Peterson had stuck with the gradual tapering, either from the medication he was on or Valium, if he would be off it by now, possibly without all the additional complications. The akathisia seems to have only very recently subsided, so the whole process doesn't seem to have helped it stop. But, in fairness, hindsight's a real bitch. Pearson responds to a criticism of 12 Rules that the contents would be necessarily sufficient for living. He puts forward instead that his intent was to instruct readers to take responsibility when bad things happen and to live a good life. Further, not to underestimate the strength in yourself or your support network. Then, while talking about finding meaning in his work,
I had to force myself to sit down at the computer. I had to force myself to concentrate and to breathe and to keep from saying and meaning to hell with it during the endless months that I was possessed by dread and terror. And I was barely able to do it. More than half the time I believed that I was going to die in one of the many hospitals in which I resided. And I believe that if I had fallen prey to resentment, for example, I would have perished once and for all, and that I am fortunate to have avoided such a fate.
If you still have your 12 Rules bingo card, you just got your resentment square. Seems they'll still work for this book. I'm not sure if this was intended to be connected or not, but in Rule 11, he talks about the to hell with it philosophy. It means many things, but in the book's context, the thoughts of an addict. But if you swap contexts, it does potentially give a little more insight into what he means here. He asks if we were better and more courageous, plus the other general virtues from the previous book, if we'd be better able to deal with, basically, the chaotic nature of life. He goes on to briefly rehash a lot of the previous book's chapters' endings, like aiming at the good, finding meaning to keep chaos at bay, and so forth. See my series for a full hash of that, both his and mine. We then start to get the old Peterson flavor style madness back while he explains the book title.
Why beyond order? It is simple, in some regard. Order is explored territory. We are in order when the actions we deem appropriate produce the results we aim at. Nonetheless, all states of order, no matter how secure and comfortable, have their flaws. Our knowledge of how to act in the world remains eternally incomplete, partly because of our profound ignorance of the vast unknown, partly because of our willful blindness, and partly because the world continues in its entropic manner to transform itself unexpectedly.
After the specific and troubling claims from Schreier in Irreversible Damage, this noodly assemblage is almost soothing. Don't get me wrong, it's a lot of words for little content, but it's not outright mocking trans youth. Also, I just want to point out that this doesn't really leave room for happy accidents, where you do something and you get an unexpected but good result, as you would have essentially missed your target in Peterson's beloved aim analogy.
Furthermore, the order we strive to impose on the world can rigidify as a consequence of ill-advised attempts to eradicate from consideration all that is unknown. When such attempts go too far, totalitarianism threatens, driven by the desire to exercise full control where such control is not possible, even in principle. This means risking a dangerous restriction of all the psychological and social changes necessary to maintain adaptation to the ever-changing world. And so we find ourselves inescapably faced with the need to move beyond order into its opposite, chaos.
As I mentioned earlier, the last book emphasized living in Order City, built up through tradition, which was surrounded by the Chaos Forest with all its attendant squirrels and tigers and dragons. So this seems to now be saying that if you clear out the Chaos Forest too well, bam, total order, which is bad. Having recently rewatched Princess Mononoke, this analogy is a little apt. This portion, though, seems to go against a repeated emphasis of the previous book. How often were readers warned not to go messing with tradition? It's been a bit, so to save you the rewatch, it was a lot. A lot. Perhaps this is a bit of course correction there. It's not. This is followed by the seemingly mandatory order is this, chaos is that portion, this time with the added wrinkle that chaos basically comes in two forms. Chaos can be fluffy and friendly when we're curious and disciplined in approaching it. Or chaos can be pointy and aggressive when we don't expect it, and then things fall apart. Minor raisin cookie of spirally doom here, with the potential of not being able to put things back together. I am intrigued if Peterson can pull himself out of Order City, but the chapter titles are not giving me much hope.
Neither the state of order nor the state of chaos is preferable intrinsically to the other. That is the wrong way to look at it. Nonetheless, in my previous book, 12 Rules for Life: An Antidote to Chaos, I focused more on how the consequences of too much chaos might be remediated.
I seem to remember a similar vibe from the Overture in 12 Rules, that we need to find this balance between order and chaos, but then the book mostly being Order City. His next point seems to touch on one of my concerns from the previous book. Peterson says that chaos is met with us preparing for the worst, but because only God himself can know what the worst actually is, we're doing a lot of prepping, which can eventually wear us down. This was my concern, that he was basically setting up readers to be hyper-vigilant in their defense against chaos. But he has a response to this. He says that the previous book emphasized that chaos needed to be managed carefully. Life without chaos adding spice to things would be uninteresting, but don't go trying to add too much chaos too fast, as that could undermine and destabilize our state of being.
Why is it spicy?
Wait, that being isn't capitalized. Did he do away with being with a capital B? Subscribe to find out.
Like 12 Rules for Life, the current volume provides an explication of rules drawn from a longer list of 42, originally published and popularized on the Q&A website Quora. Unlike my previous book, Beyond Order explores as its overarching theme how the dangers of too much security and control might be profitably avoided. Because what we understand is insufficient, as we discover when things we are striving to control nonetheless go wrong around us, we need to keep one foot within order while stretching the other tentatively into the beyond.
That didn't take long. If we're stretching a foot into chaos, that means we have our balance firmly planted in order, not on the line between the two. And this stretching into chaos is something we saw in 12 Rules. He talks about a meaning instinct that is deeper than mere thought, that keeps us exploring into chaos. And this is followed by a rule-by-rule description of what each will cover. We're going to save those for each rule as they come. At the end of this, he indicates that 12 Rules and Beyond Order were meant to complement each other as a match set, as hinted at by the white and black covers respectively. Call me cynical, but if this is the case, why was this book not hinted at in the previous one? As we talked about earlier, it seemed like 12 Rules was meant to be an elegant standalone book, especially with the repeated emphasis on not having too many rules, as that way lies tyranny. 12 rules is a workable number. 24 is a bit unwieldy. If this book sells well, are we going to eventually see all 42 of the answers from Quora in book form? Also, for being a match set, there were some interesting design choices that have been bothering the more detail-oriented folks, like the text on the spine not matching up. Whoopsies! Peterson wraps up the overture with his hopes for this book, that he's better able to convey his thoughts, that he's clarified points from the first book, and that this book will prove as useful to people as the first one. Well, this book is here, and we are set to go through the rules. We'll see if we are able to go beyond order into chaos, or if we end up back in Order City. The thought occurred to me that in that first podcast with his daughter, Peterson indicated that he was part of the target audience for that book, that he needed to follow the life advice in it too. So that knowledge, plus what we know of his experiences since the publication of that book, may give us a little bit of extra insight into what's going on behind these rules this time around. And with that thought to chew on, that's it for this video. See you guys next time. Bye!